What if your family did everything right, bought the insurance, they made the plan, and still found it difficult to use that coverage when the moment finally came? Welcome to the in between years where life doesn't come with a manual, but we've got the mic. I'm your host, Holly Westervelt. My guest today is Cory Fosco, the author of the book, The Question of When. Cory spent decades in long-term care and as a social worker and a nursing home administrator, and he wrote the book, not just to sell the book, but to help families find their way through the decisions that no one prepares you for. You can find that book at coryfosco.com. Today, we're talking about something that just doesn't get said often enough, which is that planning ahead is not the same as planning all the way. And what happens to a family when they discover the difference at the worst possible time? So, Cory, I thank you so much for being here and sharing both your experience and your own family's story with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited for today's conversation.
Absolutely. Let's start with your caregiving story and your
Uh,
mom's situation and what led you to that.
yeah, and so stepping back, it's been 34 years that I've been in this industry, and as you mentioned, social work. I did admissions and marketing. Now I'm on the technology side, and it's funny. I've had all this experience, all these years, friends and family calling me, and then it was around the COVID timeframe when my mom needed to go into a skilled nursing facility for some rehabilitation. Of course, we knew that Medicare would cover that, and her stay extended a bit because of the situation of the world. And I also knew that she opened up a long-term care insurance policy back in the 90s when she was probably my age now. And I thought, oh wow, that's good. If she does need to stay longer, if we realize that she needs more care, that was going to cover it.
Yeah.
So she allowed me to see the policy. And then I came to find out that there was this thing called a 90-day elimination period.
Mm.
And we're like, what does that mean? And so I come to find out that, with this policy, and it's actually a really good policy. What she has to do is before the policy kicked in, she had to pay privately for 90 days. And it
Oh,
does cover for her, it covers home care, assisted living. Like it's, like I said, a really good policy. However, she didn't plan for needing 3 months worth of funds for care. And so thankfully, she didn't need to go into a skilled nursing facility or any type of residential setting. She is 80 years old now. She's active. She lives out in Arizona with my brother and sister-in-law, plays mahjong like 10 times a day, 10 times a week.
nice.
But her, as she's getting older, we're starting to see she uses a walker now. While she's still driving, things are starting to slow down a bit for her.
Yeah.
And you introduced me to a term I'd never heard of, a short-term care policy. So that
Yeah.
could be an option for us with her. But again, all these years I've known about the different types of funding that are available for folks and didn't realize that until my mom was in that situation.
And I think that's really common. Somebody does all the work. She did all the right things. She got the insurance,
Yep.
you think everything's covered. And then, oh, surprise, and if that's facility care, I mean, that can be 10, 12,000
Yes.
plus a month. That's not a
Yes.
small dollar amount.
Yeah.
For people to have to cover. So it's,
Yeah.
I think it's probably good that you found that when you did, so that, if something does happen later, you have some ability, but that's a tough, tough thing.
It really is. And that's part of my mission is making sure people know that there are options available. And the earlier they talk about these things, the better they'll be prepared for the situation when it arises.
Absolutely. And I mean, and speaking of that, in your book, I know you do write tons of great advice about, how to find a facility and how to have the conversations,
Yeah.
all of that. There was one specific conversation in your book that really almost every family needs to have, and none of them actually do that. I'm going to actually read the little excerpt from it because I think a
Okay.
lot of people that are listening are avoiding it, and they're avoiding it because they don't know how to start.
Yeah.
And so the passage, it just really struck me because we talk about it so much on this podcast. It says there's a conversation that most families need to have, and very few actually do, at least not until the absence of it forces something worse. It's the conversation about what's happening, what's coming, and what the people who love your aging parent, spouse, or family member are going to do about it. It's the conversation that requires sitting down with the people you love most saying things that are hard to say. The conversation you've been avoiding is almost certainly less devastating than the one you'll be forced to have if you keep avoiding it. I think
Right.
that just struck me so
Thank
much.
you.
That's such great advice because
Yeah.
it's not about the paperwork and the logistics and all the things we think about. It's about sitting down with mom and your siblings and whatever and saying those things that are hard to say. So, it you've got a lot of expertise on this, obviously.
Mhm.
What makes that so hard that and what makes families work so hard to avoid it?
Yeah, you know what I think is the common theme is families think having the conversation is really what's going to cause the pain, right?
Mm,
So, and it's not. It's the silence that causes the pain. There's guilt behind it. There's all the promises that people think they've made to one another, and quite frankly, the earlier I talk a lot about the 72-hour decision, and what that really means is oftentimes while people are struggling to get through the day as a caregiver with somebody at home, something might happen. A fall might happen, or a disease that they might have, a progressive disease, might require them to go into a hospital, which then might require them to go into a skilled nursing facility. And typically, hospitals are for throughput, and they're not going to stay there a long time. And what happens then is they need to make this very quick decision in 72 hours. And I have a friend who's actually in a skilled nursing facility right now and needs to go home with home care. And they were told yesterday needed to make the decision yesterday. And they haven't had the time to have that conversation, right? And so I think why people avoid it is because A, it's a very personal conversation. And B, it's they're afraid that it's going to cause pain for the person on the other end. And what I like to suggest to people is starting small. Have that small conversation that might even be, if you're not safe at home anymore, where might you want to go? And
mm,
what is important to you? Is it that you want to be close to me? Is it that you want to be amongst friends, or is it that you want to, make sure they have a garden? And so if the smaller you start and you just can then build upon that conversation, it's not going to cause the pain. You're actually going to learn a lot about finding options. And it isn't necessarily even home or facility or community. There are
right.
options in between. And so you can just start small and have those conversations along the way and remove that pain and remove that what do I do now
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, and I love how you framed it of you can have many small conversations versus the one,
The big one.
emergency
Yeah.
crisis conversation,
Yeah.
which is so much easier. I think you said something really important there that I want to make sure people catch too,
Sure.
about what's important to the person that's going to be receiving the care. And like you mentioned a garden, and if that's important, when you have the conversation ahead, you actually have time to maybe find a place that has a garden or have a place of choice versus when you're in that crisis situation and you've got 72 hours, you're taking kind of what you can get. I know you talk a little bit about that as well. You want to maybe expand on how that goes?
Yeah, maybe I can use an example of my in-laws who
Mhm.
last October moved into a retirement community. So it's
Yeah.
a community that, for those who don't know, is a continuing care retirement community. So they have independent living, assisted living, they've got memory care, and they've got skilled nursing. They started to realize, and what they first made was a lifestyle decision. They said, okay, we can't really take care of this house anymore. We need to start looking for options. And there's a community that a lot of their friends live in. And so again, what was important to them was to be amongst friends, was to
Yeah.
be closer to family, but also to just leave behind the doing the lawn and doing the laundry and cooking the meals. And what I've seen in them is actually a lot of coming out of their shell and just doing different things because they were in charge of making those decisions. Not everybody has either the finances to do that or even the conversation to know that that's happening. And so what really you need to look for is taking a step back and individualizing the person's situation. right?
Mhm.
Because not everybody has memory loss. Not everybody has a
Right.
diagnosis of Alzheimer's or dementia. There are progressive diseases, COPD, CHF, maybe Parkinson's, or any other kind of situation that may not be tomorrow you need to go into what everybody calls a nursing home. And
Right.
so it's just starting to pay attention to those signals that are starting to happen. Maybe somebody is repeating themselves over and over. They're missing medications. They are missing their way on the way home from a grocery store. All those things come into play. And so at the end of the day, what you need to do is just make sure you have what I like to call the foundation, just understanding what might or might not be available to the person.
I think that's wonderful advice, and understanding their priorities is huge. You mentioned as you were talking about that and watching those signals, one thing that you mentioned in your book was like sitting at the dinner table at the
Mm.
holiday, and the siblings are kind of giving each other the side eye,
Yeah,
when they notice mom repeating herself or whatever might be happening. Like everybody knows it, and we're non-verbally communicating it, but we're not actually talking about it.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so the story I talk a lot about or have in my book is about Frank and Eleanor, who his wife was diagnosed with dementia, and he just started to cover for her
Mhm.
and make excuses. And I like to say their world started getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And the thing that gets overlooked quite a bit is the caregiver health as well. The person who and the cost of that person who is overlooking their own health. But what happened in that situation was she at 2 a.m. walked out of the house and was gone for 23 hours. So
Yeah.
all those mini conversations that the son and two daughters were having with one another all came up to a head because they couldn't find her. And fortunately she was found, but then, Frank said, "Okay, I can't do this anymore." And that
Yeah.
real conversation that they were avoiding all along, but having behind their back came out, and they realized, okay, now we need to make a decision. And Frank was talking about how he felt, I'm giving up on my wife, and that's not giving up. What I like to talk about too is that's an extension of him. It's an extension of the caregiving services
Yeah.
that the person is providing. You're just making that a much wider caregiver
That's right.
circle, right?
That's right.
And people don't think of that. They just think of this situation, of what's happening right now, but don't think about what might happen in the next day or two or week or two.
Right, right, exactly, and caregivers so much feel like they're failing if they just can't do
That's
it
right.
all sometimes, and you do a great job of addressing how no, asking for help, taking care of your own health as a caregiver is caring for the person that you love. It really is.
That gets overlooked so much. And I've been listening to a lot of podcasts lately and reading a lot of information about caregiver health and the cost of
Mhm,
caregivers. And I think we need to start paying attention to that just as much as
absolutely.
paying attention to the person who needs the care.
Mhm.
It gets overlooked so much. And I think that's where people fall into some challenges as well, is because the health of that caregiver starts to decline, and they might need placement before the person that you're dealing with does. And that just changes the situation tremendously as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and so many of them, so many caregivers even pass away before the one
That's right.
that they're caring for just because of that neglect of
That's right.
their own health,
That's right.
I think especially in the cases where it's a spouse caring for another
That's
spouse
right.
because,
Yeah.
they're aging and have their own issues as well, and so I agree with you, couldn't agree with you more that we
I,
really, as a society, need to do more for caregivers.
I
Go ahead.
think the one thing I also want to stress is the maybe the most difficult conversation isn't necessarily about, do you want home care? Do you want to move into a community? It's the finances. And I'm sure you
Yeah.
deal with that all the time.
All
And
the
and
time.
so
Yes.
right. And so that nobody wants to talk about that. Why? That's a private conversation. You
Mhm.
were raised by your parents if you're a child, and you never talked about money. You didn't talk
Right,
about your mom and dad's personal finances.
right.
But again, starting small, talking about, do you have a long term care insurance policy?
Right.
Because they might actually have one, but
Yeah.
just don't know that it exists because they avoid having the financial conversation. And I think if you are aware that there's funding available, whether that's private pay funds or something like a long term care insurance policy, the stress level of the caregiver, the children, the family, what have you, could also be eliminated about that conversation. So it's important to have that conversation while either A, the person you're caring for can still participate in that conversation and tell you, oh, yeah, I've got one in the filing cabinet.
Yep.
And you need to call Holly on the phone and she'll give you all the information. That what often happens is they start rifling through the files and all that and find
Mhm.
it, either don't find it or find it, and all the stress that comes along with that. So I want people to have not just the where do you want to go or what do you want to do? It's the what kind of finances do you have? And if you don't,
Right.
let's start learning about what other options are available to us as well.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. Because there are still a myriad of options, especially if you plan
100%.
ahead and can understand what might be coming. So I think that's wonderful advice. And so many good things you've shared. We're really coming up on our time here, but
Yeah.
I have one more question. Just given your depth of knowledge in this industry, I mean, tell me what kind of changes do you see in the industry as a whole, or even the world as a whole, that could impact caregiving or elder issues in the future?
Yeah, I think the gap between affordability and funding, and I know I just talked a little bit about that, but for the next decade, that's just going to get worse, right? The
Yeah.
care costs are climbing. I don't think we could talk too much about that. I would like to see that change. I don't know how that changes, but I think that is something that because more and more people are getting older and more people are needing to services that are available to them, and oftentimes people think Medicare is going to cover them.
Yeah.
And as I talk about in the book, and I know you talk about with folks, Medicare covers short-term rehabilitation, but it does not cover long-term care. As you
Right.
said, there are funding options available, but that gap is not going to shrink. The gap is just going to continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to really advocate to be aware of that and figure out ways to make sure that that gap shrinks. The other thing that people in the industry know about, but maybe not many folks do, is the shift that's happening is to what's called value-based care. Value-based care, easiest way to describe that is in the old funding model that still exists is a fee for service where I go into the doctor, I go into a skilled nursing facility, I get a service, and that gets reimbursed in some form or fashion. And that's really funded with the quantity is how operators get paid for that. The shift to value-based care, which I love and I want to see keep going in that way, is for quality outcomes. So what's starting to happen, and the government is saying, "Hey, we want everybody to be in a value-based care situation by 2030, is operators or practitioners are going to get reimbursed better and larger for the outcomes, the quality outcomes that they provide. Listen, the nursing home industry gets a bad rap that I and you and others are trying to get rid of. There are a lot of amazing operators out there who are focused on quality. And now that the funding model is shifting to value-based care, those that are going out to consume that, the worry about is this a good facility? There's a lot of publicly available information is going to get smaller and smaller because they're going to really reward operators that are paying attention to quality. And so I love that, and I hope that we continue to go on in that way. And then it's just folks like me and you who are providing education, are providing podcasts, are providing the support that people need and the information that people need. And I just want more and more of that to be out there
Yeah.
and people not to feel like they're out there alone.
Right.
There's a lot of support that's out there, and it's just knowing that it's there and getting the right information.
Absolutely, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more on those points. Just such good information. You're a
Yeah.
wealth of information.
Thank
I
you.
wish we had more time to even go further with the conversation, but I thank you so much for joining us today and for being so
Thank
open
you.
about not only your personal situation, but just all of the knowledge you have on this topic. For anybody that wants to go deeper on some of the things that Corey talked about, I really encourage you to check out his book, The Question of When. It's practical, it's honest, it is a tremendous guide for families that are facing these decisions. Reminder, you can find it at coryfosco.com. Here's what I hope stays with you. Having a plan and having a plan that you can actually afford to use are two different things. And the difference can cost a family everything they were trying to protect. So look at those details now while it's still just paperwork and not a crisis. That's important. So pay attention to that. We'll be back soon with another conversation worth having. Until then, take care of yourself and each other.